Hola, bueno, pues vamos entonces a tener hoy de nuevo a Sally Haslanger con nosotros para esta cuarta sesión sobre la ideología como técnica cultural. Y bueno, sin más demora le paso la palabra a Sally. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. You're so dedicated, and I appreciate that. So, actually, today's title turns out to be a bit misleading, although it was what I had planned to talk about, and I will talk a bit about cultural techne. Oh, I should put this on, right? Do I need this? Okay, and as I will talk some about ideologies of cultural techne, a kind of a subtitle might be "And Racism as a Homeostatic System," because what I'm going to do is talk about how cultural technes are embedded in these systems. And one of the reasons is that I really am very concerned to overturn ideology, to change change social practices so that they're less unjust. And so we're going to talk a bit about explanation and the different ways we need to explain social phenomena. Okay, so let's start with the beginning. So explaining injustice and racism is going to be my example. So in theorizing the phenomenon of social justice, there are many important questions, and taking racism as our primary example, we might be asking, what are the beliefs or attitudes that motivate or purportedly justify individual wrongdoing against social groups? So beliefs that Latinas and Latinos are lazy and Blacks are criminal, fear that Arabs are terrorists. What is the source of those attitudes? So that's one clearly important question. Another is, what are the institutions, laws, and social structures that impose unfair burdens on social groups, such as voter suppression laws, mass incarceration, and what is the source of those social ills? So, I mean, someone who is familiar with the tradition in critical theory might think that there's in A, it's a kind of a failing of recognition, failing of sort of individual respect and such like that. And in B, there's going to be failings of distribution and other kinds of structural failings. But both are important in thinking about racism. And C, we might be asking, what is the broadly speaking moral wrong in group-based injustice? Is the moral wrong racial bigotry or hatred, or is it structural injustice? So I'm coming from a couple of decades in work in social justice, and that this has been the background debate, that there are those who think that the source of racism is in the mind or the heart. So Jorge Garcia says that racism is a matter of the heart, and that the problem is that people lack a kind of compassion or empathy, or love or respect for others, where people like Anthony Appiah and Lawrence Blum think that the problem is in false beliefs. And so these are people who are sort of trying to locate the moral wrong in the individual, where in contrast to that, Charles Mills and I have been arguing, no, the problem really isn't in the head or the heart, the problem is in the structure of social relations. So injustice rather than moral wrongdoing is really at the heart of racism. So this, we've gone back and forth about this for a number of years. And in each of these cases, sort of driving it has been a question about what is the moral wrong that we're really having to address. Now, I think all of these are interesting and important questions, but if we care what racism is because we want to eliminate it, I think there's a prior question that we should ask, and this is D. What best explains the existence and persistence of racial wrongs, whether they be manifested in attitudes, institutions, structures, etc.? And what I actually think is that the structuralists, of which I'm one, have a better answer to this question about the explanation of social injustice. And so when we're going to then ask, well, what is the moral wrong, and what do we do about it, we should have an answer to this prior question. So racism is often assumed to be the first answer to D. Persistent racial inequality is due to racism. Thus far, Thus, this so far leaves unanswered the question of what racism is. Depending on how we spell out the answer to D, different strategies for intervention make sense. So you say, whoa, why is there such this durable injustice and these constant sort of wrongs that are done to people by virtue of their membership in a particular social group? And someone might say, well, it's all these bad attitudes. That's what racism is, because racism is going to explain these persistent injustices. And other people say, no, there's all this wrong, et cetera, because there are structures of subordination. And that's what explains this persistence of racism. Okay, but we don't have this answer yet. We have to think about what best explains it, whether it's in the individual or the structure, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in philosophical debates over racism through the past several decades, one's focus on these different A, B, or C questions has been linked, usually implicitly, to one's answer to D. In fact, a long-standing debate over the nature of racism has focused on whether we can adequately explain racial injustice in terms of pervasive bad attitudes or unjust structures, and this has divided the literature between those who want to say, well, what are the beliefs and what's wrong with those beliefs, or what are the attitudes or the heart and what's wrong with them, or what are the structures and what's wrong with them. Now, I think that's in a way a false dilemma, because what I'm going to say is that it's a system. It's a homeostatic system where the beliefs sustain the structures and the structures sustain the beliefs. And so we have to look at the system if we're going to really combat it. So how might we seek an answer to D, that what explains the existence and persistence of racial wrongs? Here, and why should it be a prior question? So Tommy Shelby notes, there's a distinctive social phenomenon that we're interested in, one with a long and tragic history that continues to this day. Suppose, for the purposes of moral criticism, that we wanted to put the phenomenon of racism into some familiar category of recognized wrongs, such as intolerance for legitimate differences. We could not do so properly if we failed to grasp the nature of the phenomenon at issue. If, for example, we were wrongly to assume that it's a response to cultural differences between racially defined groups. Social scientific research will therefore be essential to ensuring that our moral assessments are suitably informed by the relevant facts. So what he's saying is that, okay, look, this explanatory question is not, in the first instance of philosophy, it's not something you can answer a priori. A bunch of philosophers can't just sit and introspect and figure out what racism is, although they've tried, believe me. So what we need to do is we need to inform ourselves with social science to figure out what is the phenomenon of racism. How does it actually work? So Shelby goes on to invite philosophers and others to take up the role of social critic. I've talked a bit before about that role and how it's situated in critical theory, and I embrace the invitation to understand racism, what it is and how it works, as a precursor to the normative and other questions. So what we're going to do today is talk about the system that is racism, and next time I'm going to talk about it's kind of a question in metaphysics about whether, if you're understanding things in terms of systems, you can really be an individualist. I don't know. I think that's a fascinating question, but because I think that there are a lot of people who don't like to do philosophy of social science or don't believe in social phenomena because they just want to reduce it all to individuals. And so next time I'm going to talk about that, but then in the last time I'm going to move on to the normative question about critique. Okay. And as I've said before, feel free at certain points, especially at the breaks, but anytime along the way, if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and we can stop for clarification. And then the criticisms and the more substantive questions we can hold. Okay, so Shelby takes D to be the core question, as I've just suggested. And as I've mentioned before, he goes on to argue that racism is an ideology and that an ideology is a set of beliefs. And here are a couple of points that he makes, both of the times are his italics. Racism is a set of misleading beliefs and implicit attitudes about races or race relations whose wide currency serves a hegemonic social function. And he says, again, here, an ideology is a widely held set of loosely associated beliefs and implicit judgments that misrepresent significant social realities and that function through this distortion to bring about or perpetuate unjust social relations. So the idea, he seems to be siding with the individualists and saying but it's a little less individualist. He says, okay, there are these false beliefs. We have these false beliefs. They're widely shared, so there's something social about them. You can't just have one person have false beliefs and that sustain the unjust social structures, but you've got these false beliefs, and these false beliefs are responsible for racism. They are what explains the existence and persistence of racial wrongs, is the false beliefs. Right, so in Shelby's view, the best explanation of the existence and persistence of racial wrongs is a widely held set of racist beliefs. Now, I've argued elsewhere at more length against Shelby's account of ideology and his claim that it's the best answer to D. If explanation is the first task for an account of racism, then Shelby's answer just pushes the question back. Why are racist beliefs maintained in a society, especially in spite of ongoing powerful efforts to disrupt them? So he says racism is sustained by these beliefs, and then you want to say, well, yeah, but what sustains those beliefs, right? Why should we continue to hold these problematic beliefs when there's so much evidence against them, where, et cetera, et cetera? So I think that he doesn't have an adequate explanation, because you still want to know what racist beliefs are and why they are sustained. Okay, why are the racists right? So my focus on what follows will be this issue of social explanation. But in case there are some people who missed the last couple of lectures, I'll do a couple of points of review, and then we'll move on. So first of all, the limits of cognitivism and psychologism. I think ideology is not just a matter of shared belief, or even more broadly shared attitudes, if we understand sharing individualistically in terms of the attitudes that the majority happen to have. So here's one of the impulses in philosophical approaches to the social, is that the social domain is just collections of things that happen at the individual, right? So if you want to know what shared beliefs we have, you interview us, and we each, give you a set of beliefs that we have, and then shared beliefs just consists of those attitudes. And so anything that you might say at the social level, it's really just a summary of what's happening at the individual level. And I don't think that is an adequate understanding of the social domain. First of all, ideology is not cognitive and not best located in the head. I've argued that social meanings are public. It may be dominant without being held by the majority. So we may all find ways or have ways to resist the dominant ideology and not actually believe it, but know we better conform to it or else we'll be punished. So it's a source of beliefs and other attitudes, not just a summary of them. And it's contextually embedded in intersecting systems of injustice. So as I understand ideology, it plays a functional role. And Shelby actually points that out too. He says they function, if you look at his quote, it's a widely set of beliefs that function to bring about and perpetuate unjust social relations. So we have to understand them functionally. So we talked about that a bit last time. In addition, in the priority of practices and coordination, our cognitive repertoire is structured to facilitate coordination, so meaningful agency is social agency. Socialization occurs through becoming participants in social practices, and practices in the normal case orient us collectively toward produce and distribute access to resources, things taken to have value, and practices are guided by these cultural tools. So I love having a board here. But there's no, I can't use it. All right, never mind. I'm a picture person, no worries. Anyway, so I'll show you. Well, there are more pictures coming, so we can look at them in the pictures. Okay, so so in my view, an ideology is a set of social meanings or cultural tools, voila. And the internalization which shapes and organize our practical orientations in ways that result in systematic injustice. Thank you. So the cultural techne, so here's the social meanings. This is public. And then there's the things taken to have value. These get internalized in individuals. There's cognitive mechanisms that then attitudes, and then we act on the resources. Oh, gracias. We act on the resources, and this then creates the world as we know it, so that there's going to be houses and other sorts of things, and then this reinforces. So you'll have fancy houses behind gated communities, and then you'll have, slums that are broken down. I don't know how to draw a slum that's broken down. And so this then reinforces the social meanings so this was the picture that I've been talking about for the last few days. And there's a little version of the picture coming up, so. Okay, so the social meanings, this is going to be where we have the cultural techne, and this is public, and there's going to be a network of social meanings. This is going to be a net of social meanings, so it's not rigid or fixed, and then the resources are going to be things like money, time, knowledge, but also sort of things like wood, food, metal, whatever. And then we manipulate those in light of our social meanings to create the world that then reinforces our cultural techniques. Okay, so what I've just suggested is that we need a practice first count of ideology. So what we're looking at, these are practices, and the attitudes that we develop, and this is what I talked about last time, develop because we are participating in these practices. So our cognitive mechanisms are shaped so that we are guided by the particular social meanings. So, I know that this is to drink, so I don't imagine for an instant that it's gasoline, right? And so because I've already been tutored by social practices to know that I don't need to worry about drinking this because you all are taking care of me, right? So I can drink it. Okay, so it would never occur to me that it was anything other than water. I would not have to stop and say, whoa, is that water or is that poisonous, or something like that, because my attitudes have already been shaped by the social meanings, which are the practices that I know. It's a common practice that when you give a talk, you are given water to drink. Okay, so my attitudes are shaped, and then look, I just drank it, et cetera, and I interact with the world in ways that reinforce the social meanings. Okay. So you see me drink it, and then you'll assume, oh, if I give a talk and there's clear liquid, I should be able to drink it too, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So given this practice first account of ideology I've just sketched, I recommend we think of racism not as an ideology, but as an ideological formation. So these are two separate things. A racist ideology is a cultural techne that functions to create or stabilize unjust social relations along racial lines. So this cultural techne is an ideology if the practices, these are practices, that it creates are unjust. So those are unjust. Okay. The functions to create or stabilize unjust social relations along racial lines. So where Shelby has ideology in the attitudes, my ideology is in the social meanings and cultural techne. And they stabilize unjust social relations by, molding our attitudes, our cognitive mechanisms, our perceptual capacities and such to interact with the world in such a way. The racist attitudes, practices, etc., are guided or form the racist attitudes, practices, institutions, and such that are guided or formed by an ideology are ideological formations. So an attitude and all of this, these are kind of ideological formations. And so are all of these things. These are ideological formations because they are guided by and they're sustained by at some level, this cultural techne. Okay, so why worry about the difference between ideologies and ideological formations? Remember, we began with the question, what explains enduring racial inequality or injustice? Note that practices are what distribute things of value and disvalue. Toxic waste is dumped in poor Black neighborhoods, and good schools built in the white suburbs. Of course, these practices are not arbitrary. There's no surprise where the good stuff ends up. But the distribution of goods doesn't end up how it does because of what most people believe, for it's just as true that individuals share racist beliefs because they live in a world in which certain groups get the good stuff. We learn about race and what different races deserve by looking around us. So I'm not denying there's a causal connection between the technes and the distribution of resources, but I also think that the distribution of resources is responsible for the techne. So there's going to be a systematic interdependence here that we have to take account of. And this is kind of what Shelby's picture doesn't get. It's as if, we just have these racist beliefs. He's got one side of the system going, but he misses the other side. And the other side is partly what makes it so durable and hard to change. So there is causal connections, as I'm not denying there's causal connections between the technes and our attitudes and our practices. But if we want to explain the durability and the persistence of racial injustice, we have to get the other side as well. Okay. More plausibly, racism is constituted by an interconnected web of unjust social practices that oppress certain racialized groups. And if you're worried about me using the term race, I included a footnote here that I have a social constructionist account of race. If you want to talk about it in the Q&A, that's fine. For example, residential segregation, police brutality, biased hiring and wage inequity, educational disadvantage, etc. So racism is going to be the systematic, set of systematic and interdependent social practices. And the wrongs of question can be wrongs of recognition, distribution, or other forms of oppression. They're not random practices, but are connected by a racist techne. But due to the looping effects that connect agents, meanings, and material conditions, the racist techne is both a product and a source of racism. So here's the picture, the little arrow that, like lightning, is supposed to be police brutality. The peso or dollar sign is supposed to be, wealth, and the apple is education, and that, Pentagon is a house or whatever. So you get these things that are going to be shaped and molded through the, first they're noticed as valuable through the cultural techne, and then they're shaped and they're molded as we guide our actions and guide our practices to construct, educated people or uneducated people, etc. So that this is the dynamic picture. The ideology, whether understood in terms of sets of beliefs or techne, is not what explains the existence and persistence of racial wrongs. The problem is systemic, so we need to consider how to explain systems, right? So now we want to say there's a system here, interdependent parts of a system, and now if we want to explain, if we say that racial inequality is a system, and we want to explain that system, we've got to figure out how systems get explained. Okay, so racial inequality is a systematic phenomenon best understood in terms of what I call dynamic homeostasis. Not I, but is called dynamic homeostasis. So consider a homeostatic or self-perpetuating system, such as a stick in a stream held against a rock by the backwash. So a stick floats down the stream and cannot pass over the rock because each time it approaches the rock, it's dragged down into the churning water that the rock produces. So here's the picture. It's not as beautifully, it's not a beautiful image, but there's a large black mass on the right-hand side. And that could be a rock or a dam or something like that. And if you have a stick going along the top of the water, there's going to be a chance it will go over the top if it's light enough. But if it's not light enough, what happens is that the water hitting the dam or the rock will go under, and it will take the stick with it. But then the water coming from upstream will press against it, so it doesn't just continue upstream. The pressure from the water coming down will push it around again toward the top, and it will continue to circle like this, unless there's a flood or something like that, so the flood can carry it over, or if the rock is worn down, or various things can happen, but it is a self-perpetuating system. And those are called, in general, homeostatic systems. So what is important in characterizing a homeostatic system is that there's a mechanism or set of mechanisms that register changes in a system and prompt countermeasures to resist or reverse the change. So ecosystems are homeostatic systems, our bodies are homeostatic system, and if you Google homeostatic system, I bet the first hit will be body temperature, right? Because body temperature, so what happens is if your body temperature goes up, then you start to sweat, and the breeze cools you down, the whole system. And so you have a self-regulating system in the body that is body temperature. Another is a thermostat. People often talk about thermostats, which is similar, right? When the temperature goes up, something is triggered in the thermostat to turn on the air conditioning, or if it goes down, turn on the heat or whatever like that. And so there is a kind of self-regulating system. Now, plausibly, any stable society is a dynamic homeostasis. Ron Mallon has argued, so we're going to have a dynamic homeostasis of coordination. So we're going to, and remember in the last couple of times I've talked about practices and how there's pressure to maintain the regularities that are constitutive of that practice through normative pressures and such, but also through the built environment and the ways in which our bodies interact with bits of the world. We take advantage of that and use that. So Ron Mallon has argued that social roles constitute relatively stable homeostatic property clusters. Here's a quote: "Occupants of robust social roles will share a variety of interesting and important properties worthy of notice in social life and social theory. And the mechanism by which they share these properties is the social role that they occupy." So he's worried about, are there such things as social kinds? And he said, yes, there are social kinds. Kinds are explanatory. They provide a basis for induction, et cetera, et cetera. And once you see what a social role is, you can see that there's a kind of stable clustering of properties. So these are homeostatic property clusters. He draws on this from Boyd and others in the philosophy of science, where they're thinking about species. But there's homeostatic property clusters where you say, once a social role has been instituted, then there's going to be a kind of stability in the clustering of properties around that social role. So here's an example. Students will tend to have certain similarities in their abilities. They'll be literate, they'll be good at picking up information through in verbal ways, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We know that. They'll have similarities in the shape of their daily lives and schedules. They will respond in similar ways to those whose roles are linked with theirs, for example, teachers and administrators. And they have these similarities because they are students. So being a student has some predictive power. Moreover, if a student's behavior varies substantially from their role, they will be nudged back by others around them, or they will not remain a student. So there's this stability of that social role. There's a property cluster that remains stable over time, and it remains stable in part because we punish students who don't conform to the certain expectations of what students should do and students should be, et cetera. We link our social roles to their social roles. So there's going to be a kind of pattern of stable kinds that are social kinds: professor, student, administrator, professor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now these roles are going to, in some cases, say something about each of us, so we can come to have an identity associated with them, but there's also a dynamism. We can move between them. The roles themselves can change over time. So academic institutions thus create roles and maintain them, as do other institutions, and also less formal practices. Such social systems are stable but dynamic. Changes in climate or laws of the economy can prompt development. The adjustments in response to changes in a part of the system don't always return the system exactly to the original state, but can allow a shift in new terms of coordination. So I think that for right now in the United States anyway, universities are becoming corporatized, and students are now our clients or our consumers. And so there's a whole different set of practices that are instituted in universities that are quite different from what happened before. And that's in part because of the pressures on the university to make money or to raise money from the corporate sector because federal money has been significantly reduced. So in the United States, I mean, I know this being at MIT, in the United States, at MIT in particular, because the federal funding has been reduced, MIT has to rely on corporate investment and other investment. And what the corporations want is widgets. Do you use that, widgets? Widgets are little things that engineers make that are useful, right, for things. That's a generic term, a widget, and so they want widgets. And sometimes widgets are software widgets, and sometimes there's like little things. And so what we need to do is put more money into engineering because engineers build widgets and corporations want widgets, and then philosophers don't make widgets, right? And so we don't get the kind of funding, etc. Where in the old days, liberal education, it was sort of thought that as an educated citizen, what we're doing in universities is creating educated citizens, people who are going to live good lives. That's what universities are for. And so we need philosophy, but now it's all about the widget. Okay. So that's an example of how there's a change in the economy, a change then, and this is partly too because of a change in ideology in the cultural techne. And so here's a system that is looping around and making a difference to our lives. Okay, so the economy, the culture, the geographic conditions, the food supply, the legal system, transportation system, etc., create roles and relations to enable individuals to coordinate. These are maintained through social pressure, like as the student, the professor pressures the student to get their work in on time, the policies and laws, and also creation of artifacts and the arrangement of the built environment. For example, in some cultures, food is served on tables and eaten with knives, spoons, and forks, and others, food is served on banana leaves on the floor and eaten with the right hand. Bodies are conditioned to such routine behavior, and changing is not only imaginatively, but physically difficult. So if you are not used to sitting on the floor all the time and eating your food with just one hand, it's difficult to adjust to that. And so these practices sort of become us. I think I said it in an earlier time. Our bodies are shaped by these practices, and then it becomes very difficult to do things very differently. So this is to get the sense of what I'm trying to get at here, and I'm going to elaborate it, is that we have minds, of course, and minds play a role here, and then social things like institutions and policies and those sorts of things, but they also affect the environment that we're in, and the motions and capacities of our body are affected. And then that reinforces what actually the techne that set us up this way. So the techne of eating with knives and forks and spoons, that just becomes, what one does. And there are these fancy ways of etiquette for doing it the right way, which fork and things like that. And then that creates these kind of social divisions, which you say, oh, they didn't eat with the right fork, or they touched the food with the wrong hand, or things like that, that then reinforce that these are the meanings, and we punish each other for not doing it correctly. So there are multiple determinants of social stratification in a society: wealth, status, prestige, power, authority, autonomy, opportunity, to name a few. And in a stratified society, there are mechanisms that stably position groups hierarchically along those dimensions. Okay, so this is going to, remember, we're talking about a homeostatic system where it's like the stick against the rock. There's going to be a system of meanings and practices and built environments that keep people in their social roles like the stick against the rock. Now, of course, if things change dramatically, if you've got a flood, right, Katrina, or, I know Katrina is a different figure for you. For us, it's the flood in Louisiana. For you, it's the Day of the Dead. Anyway, Katrina, that can change because it changes the material conditions so dramatically that people have to rebuild and recreate something. And sometimes there can be, you know, a brilliant person, a great leader who comes up with a fabulous slogan or whatever like that to change things. But these different distributions of power and authority, status, autonomy, and such creates these social roles that are stable, and they're interacting with each other, and so they constitute mechanisms that keep the society going, right? Okay, homeostasis explains the persistence of hierarchy. Changes in part of the system are adjusted for elsewhere so that the status quo is maintained. But although relatively stable, there is a historical development. The adjustments can allow a shift to a different sort of hierarchical structure. For example, in the case of African Americans, chattel slavery evolved into Jim Crow segregation, which evolved into the current hierarchy maintained by mass incarceration, felonization, ghettoization, economic marginalization, and cultural stigma. So Jim Crow was held in place by law. It was a mandated segregation, so there were separate toilets and separate water fountains and separate residential areas, and that, you know, was changed when the Civil Rights Act was passed, but still there's tremendous segregation. So in fact, if you look at the school districts where there were segregation orders in the 60s and 70s, I mean, integration orders in the 60s and 70s so that schools had to integrate, many of those orders were removed in the 90s. And if you go back and you look at those school districts, they're just about as segregated as they were before the integration orders were in place. And so here we need another explanation of why that's going on, because it's not just a matter of law, right? Other things are maintaining the ongoing racism and the ongoing segregation. And so there are a variety of things that people have pointed to, and including the imposition of mass incarceration and such, which removes, you know, people from their families and represents them as this group of people as criminal, untrustworthy, et cetera, so they don't get jobs, and then they don't get jobs, they can't move out of these segregated areas. So it's a long story there. I won't go into it, but I can give you references if you're interested in reading about this. So in the terms I've suggested, systemic racial injustice is explained by the systematic looping of schemas and resources that occurs in practices and the structures they form. Practices are guided by ideology, a racist cultural techne, but the ideology is not an independent causal factor, and that's why it's defined functionally. There are times when it's important to single out ideology, beliefs, or emotional states as a significant factor in response to certain questions. But to focus entirely on beliefs or compassion or ideology would be tantamount to explaining why the temperature of the room remains constant by simply pointing to the fact that the thermostat is set at 68 degrees. So you say, why is the temperature at 68? 68 is 20 degrees. And so why is the temperature 20 degrees? Well, Sally said it there. Well, that's part of the answer to the question, but you really need to know why it stays at 28. You need to know how a thermostat works and what the whole process is behind the adjustment of air conditioning or heating or whatever to maintain that temperature. The workings of the thermostat and the heating or cooling system are crucial to understanding the phenomenon of stable temperature, just as the process by which cultural technes are formed, performed, and reinscribed through their impact on the material conditions explains social stability and evolution. Let me pause. Questions? Clarification? Do you see what's going on here? Yes?
Yes, I have a question about how change challenges the homeostasis that you're considering. Because as I understand, the changes seem to be secondary, or I don't see how they build inside of this mechanism. And so currently thinking of the situation in the US, where some of those resources seem to be displaced to a different way of working of the society, seem to be also a possibility to operate this ideology that has that has stayed underlying or silent without being vocal. It seems that the resources are directed to a liberal kind of ideology, but on the other hand, it backfires and it operates in a silent level that seems to be invisible in some way. But then comes around how that would be managed in this.
Oh, good. So let me see if I have the question. So the idea is that we look like we're a kind of liberal state, liberal government, et cetera, but really there's another ideology that is shaping our relations. And so when Obama, for example, leaves office and Trump comes in, that just exposes itself, something like that. Yeah, so I think in the United States, there's going to be part of the issue is seeing that there are multiple practices and multiple ideologies that are guiding us. And so in one context, there's a certain dominant ideology of liberty and equality for all that people think is driving us, right? The Obama kind of liberty and equality kind of notion. But if you see how his practices have material consequences, some of those material consequences actually don't provide liberty and equality for all, even though they're trying to, and I think he literally was very committed to trying to make them, but they don't have that effect for a lot of people, given their material conditions. So there are, for example, the Obamacare that was a compromise between the Democrats and the Republicans, and it seemed like it was something that nobody was happy with, but it was a possible compromise, and it did help the uninsured. But for a certain level of the middle class, it was terrible because they're having to pay a huge amount of money to buy into Obamacare. So the material realities of Obamacare for that group of people, they're saying, hey, wait a minute, these poor people, these Black people, whatever, they get insurance for nothing. But what about me? I have to pay this huge amount of money. So this liberty and justice, liberty and equality for all, given their material conditions, they don't experience it as liberty and equality for all. And then that group is going to rebel and protest. No, we want liberty of a different sort or equality of a different sort. And the problem is that when you have these very, very, very different constituencies that you're trying to respond to, what one person will be an increase in equality for them, very often it is a reduction or a perceived reduction on the part of the others. And then they rebel and they say, oh, no, we don't want Black people or poor people to get all these good things because they're getting them and we're not. And so there's a kind of constant process of adjustment that goes back and forth. Is this at all responsive to?
Could we understand this as if on one side discourse and belief could be being separated from ideology and material consequence in some way?
I see. So one way to put it is that the techne, the social meanings, you have liberty and equality. Those are kind of social meanings, and they're very vague and they're very abstract. And there's also what counts as liberty. Well, in a particular social milieu, when someone takes up a commitment to liberty, they will see liberty in different ways. So as someone said recently, one of the politicians supporting the new Trump healthcare plan said, yes, they may not have health care, but they have freedom. And you're going, oh my God, this is because they're not forced to get health care. They can freely choose not to have health care. So this idea of liberty in a context of certain practices has a particular shape, but in a context of other practices has another shape. So choosing not to have healthcare seems like, for certain groups of people, a sign of liberty, right? I'm free to make my own choices about whether I want to spend money on healthcare or not. And so, but for others, this social meaning in a different set of practices is taken up differently. So, for example, so here you consider someone who, from this certain part of the middle class, who is very poor, so to give you a sense, so for some people, healthcare under the Obama plan has a deductible where you have to pay that before you get anything back from the government or the plan. You have to pay $8,000 or even $10,000 out of pocket when you go to the hospital. So you have a car accident, you go to the hospital, you have insurance. Okay, the first $8,000 you pay, and then the rest of it is paid for by your healthcare plan. People can't afford $8,000 out of pocket to cover, their stay in the hospital. And so what happens is, for people who are very poor, they don't have to pay that. And so it's liberty. It's a liberty to go to the hospital instead of just using, or instead of just going without. But for people who have this large expense, it's not liberty, right? Because they're having to pay this huge amount of money in order to go to the hospital. So I think that and so for the people in the middle class to say, look, I'm never going to use this healthcare plan because I'm never going to go to the hospital and have $8,000 that I have to pay, right? And so, because I don't have that kind of money. And so for them, they're just giving money, they experience it as giving money to the government for a system that they're never really going to use. So what I think is that the social meaning, liberty, is going to mean different things depending on the material conditions that you're in and the practices that you're engaged in. You're going to the hospital or not going to the hospital. You're paying your bills or not paying your bills. And so this social meaning is then fragmented as it's enacted through these different practices. And then what happens is that, people say, yeah, this is really great, this healthcare plan, we love it. And then they're saying, oh no, because you can't see how that ideology and that is really playing itself out in our lives. And then they say, look, yeah, so the poor people are freer to go to the hospital, but we're not. And so then they raise up and they vote for Trump, and then, yeah, well, I don't want to go there. Does that help?
Yes.
Yes.
I like to see that you assign a role, or you assign a role in the static system to hasty generalizations and prejudice.
Yes. No, there is going to be hasty. So and what I've been emphasizing, and it's partly a matter of emphasis because I'm trying to counter a certain tendency. So on my view, these meanings and the attitudes are supported by the reality that is created. So there is this looping. So you say, yeah, so one example I've used before is, so poor people, and oftentimes the United States, they're poor people of color, they're unreliable, so we don't want to hire them in our jobs. Well, why are they unreliable? Because they have to use public transportation to get to work, and public transportation is a mess, right? They don't have cars that they can just get in and get there on time. And so there's the whole system reinforces, so it's true in a sense that they don't get to work on time, they don't do this and do that, but that's because of the material conditions where they have to rely on a bad transportation system, which then is going to be unfunded because the rich people have their own cars, right? So what I'm interested in is the ways in which sometimes there are truths when someone says, we're not going to hire this poor person of color because they're really likely to be totally unreliable. We'll hire this white person with a car, but that reinforces the whole system. And so what I've been emphasizing is the ways in which the system the ideology makes itself true, but you're exactly right, that's partly a hasty generalization, because this person, may not be like that, It also may be the case that we should give them a chance. So there's a lot of, and we also should say, just because they're dark skinned doesn't mean that they're poor. So you can't assume that as well. So there are lots and lots of hasty generalizations and falsehoods. And I completely grant that, but I also think that you can't just try to change people's minds without changing what's going on in the world, right? Because if you hire a bunch of poor people who have to rely on public transportation, they're not going to be as reliable getting to work on time because the public transportation system is so terrible, right?
Or you may say something that is true about a subgroup of the whole class, and you generalize to the whole group.
Yeah. So I agree. So that generalizations about a whole group that you then assume of a particular individual are problematic. And I do think that you need to be more careful about generalizing and applying those generalizations to an individual. But I don't think that just giving a few people more chances by having justified and careful beliefs about them is going to change the system. I'm an example, right? I'm a woman in philosophy. People gave me a chance. I was very lucky, right? And I continue to be lucky. I've been in the profession. I graduated my PhD in 1985. And until this year, for the 3 years before, I was still the only woman in my department. Do you know how sick of that I am? I am so sick of being the only woman in my faculty member in my department. I am so sick of having been given a chance. And people don't make generalizations about my, incapacities for doing philosophy anymore, but I am the exception, right? And so, so part of this comes out of my feeling as though, yeah, we shouldn't make generalizations about people, but giving people a chance and seeing them as individuals, I'm sorry, I'm just discouraged by that.
There's one more question.
Yes.
Well, I will probably, you can answer this at the end.
Okay.
I was wondering how much you are willing to see this table of homeostatic property clusters or social classes as similar to each other, or how much would you want to make a further classifications? And specifically, if race is a special kind of social class or cluster, because the example of the student, if you compare it to race, it's so very different.
Yes.
Being a student in a society, you can stop being a student, you can grow out of being a student, but being of a particular race is not as movable.
Totally.
And so, is it really so comparable? That's really the question. Or if you put gender in, it's also really so comparable.
Yeah, totally. Excellent question. So in some of my earlier work, I've been interested in these categories that I sometimes call indelible, like you can't erase them. You can't get rid of them because they're marked on the body. So gender and race are two of the paradigm examples of being marked on the body. I also think ethnicity, insofar it's associated with fluency in a language and a way of life, that it's very hard to overcome some of the markings of ethnicity. And so it has a kind of quasi-indelible dimension to it. So I think, though, that that these special categories of race and gender are fixed in part because the basis for ascribing functional roles is physical, right? So when you want to look at men and women, I think that we understand. I'm going to do this really quickly, though it could take us way, but we can come back to it in the discussion. So on my view, there's sex and there's gender and there's what I call color and there's race. And color isn't just skin color, it's all the markings of the racial markings. And what happens in the case of gender and race is that these social meanings, that got kind of erased, but the social meanings of certain parts of the body. So social meanings of skin color, hair texture, eyelid shape, and all of that are such that those social meanings then are very prevalent and they're important for our engagement and practices. So we become super attentive to what texture of hair that person has and what eyelid shape, but without even really having to be very conscious about it. And then this filters our sense of our attitude. So the only Black people we see are the Black people who are poor. We lose track, or whatever. So for example, you go into this is example very common in the U.S. You will, if you're a Black man and are going to a very fancy party, and there are other people there, people will give you their coats and say, could you hang this up for me, please? Because they can't see a Black man as civilized, sophisticated, whatever like that, and appropriately at the party. And so that affects what we can see, and then that engages us with our practices and what we do, etc. But what's at issue here is the social meanings of the body. And the same is true for women's bodies and men's bodies. The social meaning of the body then divides us according to, these social roles, what women do, what men do, what people of color do, and things like that. And so this is marked on our bodies, but for certain other social roles, like student, it isn't marked on the body. Now it's a little bit marked on the body because students are assumed to be young. So if you're a returning student like a woman who's been married and had kids and comes back to school, people find it hard to see her as a student. So there's some markings of the body, but it's not like these others. And so that's why one of the reasons why these, I think, are deeply persistent is because they're soon to be natural. Student isn't assumed to be natural. They're marked in this particular embodied way. Does that help?
Yeah, well, a complementary question, complementary is not the word.
Yeah, sure.
A follow-up question is a Latino a race?
Yeah,
Because,
I know. Hard question.
Don't have everybody looking the same.
I know. So there's a wonderful paper by Linda Alcoff called "Is Latino / because Latin, I don't know what you use here. I mean, it's in America, we're trying to figure this out, but whether it's Latinx or Latino or whatever, and she writes it LATINO/A or A/O. Anyway, so she says, is that a racial identity? And she suggests that we need a category of ethno-race, which is different from the race from Blacks, but it's not just an ethnicity, because an ethnicity is a culture, and she's from Panama, and she says, I don't like hot, spicy food, I don't eat tacos, whatever, like this. And she actually looks at, in different parts of the US, the assumptions about Latinos and Latinas. It depends on, so in the Southwest, it's a lot about Cuba and the Caribbean, and from the Pacific, there's a lot of assumptions about everything. So there are many different kinds of ethnicities and different ethnic assumptions, but she wants to say that there is something called an ethno-race. So this is Alcoff. But there's also, if you look at, Spiritu, also Bob Gooding Williams, many of them. So Spiritu and Alcoff both are interested in something like ethno-race. Spiritu uses the term pan-ethnicity. And the idea of pan-ethnicity is, if you think about Asian cultures, in Asia, the different cultures have hated each other, fought against each other, and the thought that they're like a racial group is like, whoa, it's hard for them even, when they first immigrate, to sort of understand why they're all clumped together, because one thing's for sure, they're not them, or, whatever. And so what happens with an ethno-race is that the dominant culture racializes them and takes them to be similar. And so, but the similarities are going to be based in a kind of marking of the body. And then what happens is that you form something like Asian American. That is an ethno-race. It's an ethnicity that has been constructed by the racialization of a group. And so the same would be true, I think Linda wants to say, the same is true of Latino, Latina, Hispanic, whatever the Latinx, whatever the best term is. And they say it's a construction of the dominant group to create a category that is really a racial category in the sense that it's marked on the body or sometimes just by accent or something like that. And it's assumed to have a kind of ethnic unity, even though it doesn't have an ethnic unity. But it might develop in the United States, for example, Asian American has developed a unity. So what Louis Spiritu is talking about is he says, yes, there is an identity as Asian American because we have come together to respond to the racialization of our group. So we are no longer Chinese or Indian or Japanese. We are Asian Americans, and we together fight the dominant, racialization of our group. Does that help?
Yeah, yes.
There's one more question I really want to take it now,
No,
or
it's
maybe
whatever.
afterwards, yes?
I have
Then several of them. Okay, yes.
I
It's
was wondering if, in the case of race, it's quite obvious the kind of oppression and the structural meanings that operates in a oppressive and pervasive ways, right? But I was wondering whether you need an accountability of justice, or where does it really enters in your homeostatic system, because there's others kind of oppression, inequality, lack of liberty that is not quite obvious to us, right? In
Yes.
these kind of societies.
Yes.
Besides race or gender. So I was wondering if you have an account of what counts as meanings of equality or liberty that are really ideological social meanings, because I suppose that not all of them count as ideological social meanings. Depends on the effect they exist in.
Right, good question. So I'm going to talk a lot more about this on Friday, but this is a mess up here, isn't it? Can you make sense of it anymore? Hold on one second, I'm going to get rid of some of this. Okay, so what happens is that there's two questions. One is, what is valuable, what is unfair, right? Those questions. And then how do we know that? How do we know what is valuable and what is fair, right? So those are things. Now, what I want to say, first and foremost, is that what counts as a resource is going to be guided by the social meanings that we have available. So in Massachusetts, crickets are not food, right? In Mexico City, they are food, right? So food is something that is a matter of social meaning in part. It's not completely, because if you drink gasoline, of course, that's not food. But so it's partly a matter of social meaning. And so what I think we have to do is social meanings, they are, let's put, just to make it simple, create value or purported value. And then they also distribute what is valuable. Distribute is a simplification too, because also they produce, they enable us to produce and all sorts of things. So there's going to be at least two sites for critique of these practices. One is that that the practice is too limited in what it allows us to value, right, or to see. So I'm a pluralist about value. And a pluralist says there are many different ways of valuing things. Some things you value, they have use value, you value them because they're useful, some because they're worthy of awe or respect, others because they are beautiful and you have aesthetic value. And so one way you can critique a system like this is saying that it either has us value the wrong things or it reduces our capacity to value things. So capitalism treats everything as having use value and only use value or commodity value, bad, right? Because there are things, other ways of valuing things, et cetera, et cetera. Then another thing is distribution. So here you can say, in addition to what is recognized as valuable, practices distribute it, they make it, and then they produce, And so then there are issues about fairness of distributions. So some practices are bad because the distributions that they encourage or make possible, et cetera, are unfair or unjust. Okay, that's the background. I also think that there's a different version here too, a different way to think about it. And one more, but I don't want to get into it yet. And so then the question is, yeah, fine, but how do we know which are the ones that have reduced the value, which are the ones that have done it unfairly? And I'm going to hold off until Friday to talk about that, okay? Because I have a non-ideal way of thinking about gaining knowledge about what's valuable, because I don't think you can figure that out a priori. I think that you have to figure it out in practice. So we're going to have to go there.
Yeah, I'm just, I would be a little concerned about this idea of how they lump a whole group of people together and then they view them in a certain way when they're very, very different physically and their different cultural differences and so on. But one worry, I mean, and I like the idea of the social construction of race, and there's a racialization of groups and so on. The idea of an ethno-race is interesting as well. But I find it, so for example, think about Muslims nowadays in the US and in the UK and just, so in Europe in general and other places as well. They don't constitute, I mean, there's no way of making them into a racial group or, I mean, ethnically the same. It could be, I mean, it seems to be a bit of a stretch of the imagination to do that. And I just was wondering whether there was any fit for them, because there is a sense in which, there's a prejudice against that particular group, and there's a uniformity and bad attributes that are given to them and so on. So I'm not so sure that the idea of an ethno-race would be quite accurate. I think it would be stretching it way too far. I mean, there's a limit. So the idea of color seemed to me interesting to an extent. It depends how much gets packed in there. I mean, of course, you've got the stricter Muslims that wear a headscarf and women and do things like that. But maybe there's some, but they're very, very moderate and sort of practicing Muslims who don't observe any of it. So I just don't know, if anything of this is going to stretch that far. Maybe it's not meant to.
Wonderful. Really important. So there's a move in sort of critical race theory to have a category of AMEMSA, which is Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian, right? And so this is a group of marked people. So I have a friend who's a philosopher. His name is Adam Hussein. Adam grew up in Trinidad. There were many Trinidadians whose ancestry is from India, and he looks Indian, so South Asian. He looks South Asian. He did grow up Muslim. He moved from Trinidad to Wales, and most of his life he's lived in the UK. He speaks with a slight English accent, but he's stopped at the border all the time. And his father won't even come to the United States anymore from the UK because Adam lived in Colorado. He will land in New York to change planes, and he will never make his connection because he stopped. So here's an example, I think, of a marking of a group.
But Eastern European Muslims are not going to be lumped in that group.
Right, so they won't be lumped in that group unless they have a certain appearance or they indicate their affiliation with this group. So this is the group that's being racialized, I think. It's being racialized. And I think what happens is just as during the Second World War, you couldn't always tell someone Jewish from non-Jewish. They put stars, right? That was how you did it. So if you don't have the right appearance, so that it's ambiguous what your color is, then there are other kinds of markings that you're looking for. And this is what racial profiling is about. You're taught to look at the kind of walk or talk or behavior or movement of the body or clothing or dress or all of these things that indicate that you're really Arab. So, I mean, Adam has no Arab ancestry. You know, he's Muslim, but he's and he's not even South Asian very immediately. But this is how the racialization works. And then you start to be able to distinguish. And, you know, in the former Yugoslavia, I guess what's interesting is even though the Croatians and the Serbs are basically indistinguishable from each other, I think that those groups became racialized and people started to think that they could distinguish. But when they said, oh yeah, I could tell, often it was based on, I could tell just by looking at them. This is how the social meanings filter and give us attitudes. I could tell by looking at them. Well, that meant there was, you know, maybe the kind of food they ate or what they were doing on certain days of the week or things like that became a way they looked to each other. So I think that, I mean, I love this question because it is so complicated, but it's at the heart of what I'm trying to understand is how the meanings of things like the body, but also movements and accent and clothing and behavior those social meanings come to infiltrate our ability to perceive and respond and feel compassion and all of that, which then gets enacted in things like police profiling or immigration profiling. And then once you've been stopped at the border, your behavior changes, potentially other people's behavior toward you changes. That might reinforce, you know, because you become more anxious and nervous before you go through. If you're anxious, what are you anxious about? Are you hiding something? And then you see how it goes. But I do think it's an interesting, so Adam, he's just accepted a job at Northeastern in the Boston area, which is very exciting for me. But he's worked a little bit on this, so you might look at that.
There are 3 more questions. I don't know whether you would like to take them.
So what others want to
proceed?
What time? I don't have a clock. 19. So we have about 40 minutes?
That's right, yes.
So why don't I kind of rush through some of this and then we can take more questions, okay?
Yes, I have your questions and you too. Okay. Yes, I have you.
I hope, this is so interesting. I hope, and I'm not going to go back and bore you to death. All right, well, so the point of the next section is to think about the picture I've suggested is overly deterministic and doesn't give us space for human agency. Right? And let's skip that first picture, because if we're just little cogs in this homeostatic machine, right? Whoa, that feels like, what can I do? I'm just this stick going around and around and around. What can I do to get out of it, right? Something like that. And so the worry is, whoa, this is way too deterministic and doesn't give enough opportunity for agency. So second paragraph under 4, recall the idea of a social topography. I gave you a lovely picture of that a couple times ago. Social systems create a space for agency, and this results in patterns, but it need not determine an individual's choice. To see this, it's helpful to note there are multiple forms of explanation. Alan Garfinkel has argued that explanations are best understood as answers to questions, and different questions call for different sorts of answers. The key to appreciating the differences is in the logic of questions. The starting point of Garfinkel's analysis is an anecdote. When Willie Sutton, a famous bank robber, was in prison, a priest who was trying to reform him asked him why he robbed banks. Well, Sutton replied, that's where the money is. Funny, it's supposed to be funny. Anyway, now Garfinkel uses his analysis of this conversation to argue that questions are best understood as having a focus and a set of foils. For example, compare. Why do you rob banks as opposed to deposit your money there? Or why do you rob banks as opposed to grocery stores, right? So there are two, the emphasis, the italics is the focus, and as opposed to is the foil. And you can get a variety of different foils, but and Garfinkel's idea is that questions really need to be understood in these terms as focus and foil in order to give an adequate answer. So the more fine-grained analysis of questions allows us to appreciate that not all explanation concerns what Dretske has called triggering causes. So in the social topology map, what pushes the ball, what gets the ball rolling down that topology is one thing, that's the triggering cause, but how it moves is shaped by the landscape. And this is the similar, so here's another set of questions. Why does Lester sell drugs? Possible answers. Because he wants money and thinks selling drugs is the best way to do it. That's rational choice explanation. Because he was brought up without a father. He's predisposed to crime. So these are all individualistic explanations of his behavior. But if we add focus and foils, it's clear that the question shifts its point. Why does Lester sell drugs rather than cars? Possible answer. Because he lives in ghetto poverty and can't get a job selling cars, or in fact, any job other than selling drugs. So that shifts the focus, not to Lester's individual sort of mental states or capacities or genetic background or whatever like that. It moves it to looking at the social context for Lester's choice. Why does Lester, rather than Marla, his partner, sell drugs? Possible answer, because the drug scene is a male world and Marla couldn't cut it. So their gender is going to be, so poverty, gender, these are all factors that are going to be relevant in explaining Lester's choices. So in 4 and 5, the issue doesn't concern Lester's reasons or his psychology, but the context of his choice and the structure of social relations within which he chooses. The suggested answers to 4 and 5, however, are in some sense more powerful than the answers suggested to 3, because they capture regularities that extend beyond Lester to others in his social position. So you could say, Lester as an individual who's functioning in a particular social role, and you're saying, why does Lester and, just list a number of different people in the same social role as Lester, and you could get an equally good explanation. Regardless of their, mental states, they do it because this is the only option available to them. Similarly, situating racist actions within structures does not sacrifice agency, rather it contextualizes agency so that we can better evaluate it. Okay, social change. I'll keep moving so we can get back to the more fun stuff, which is the questions. If social structures are homeostatic systems, then it's not surprising that social change is difficult. But you might ask, how is it even possible? Even if moral heroes attempt to bring about change, won't the system adjust to prevent them from doing so? In a previous paper, I argued that the emphasis on implicit bias in addressing the issue of social justice was misplaced, and that we should focus instead on addressing structural and material injustice. And some have interpreted me as claiming that efforts to promote prejudice reduction are not helpful, and that structural change should always take priority over psychological intervention. So here the issue is, I said, in this other context, look, we can't change the world by doing implicit bias trainings. That's not going to be enough. And people read me as saying implicit bias trainings are pointless because it's not about individuals. So I want to emphasize it's clear. So when we're trying to think about what can we do in this whole thing, implicit bias training is one thing we can do. And this comes back to, hasty generalizations and misjudgments and things like that. That's something we should do. It's clear that both individual and structural changes are needed to achieve social justice, and what interventions are most effective is an empirical matter. Moreover, it makes a huge difference what interventions in prejudice reduction are employed. Some forms of implicit bias training are specifically designed to connect bias to unjust social practices and broader structures. And moreover, some social structural changes will be ineffective and others will risk backlash that will make things worse overall. And we'll usually need prejudice reduction amongst elites to be successful in even attempting structural change. So we do need individual interventions and all of these sorts of things. We need good individual interventions, not just crummy ones. So I want to allow that efforts to promote structural change should not have priority over all efforts at changing hearts and minds. My concern, however, is that emphasis on what and how we think is only a small part of what sustains racism. But then how do we make a difference? Of course, individual minds coordinate with other individual minds in the world on terms that are always up for negotiation. Sometimes we negotiate with others over the terms of coordination. Other times we unilaterally change the world to force renegotiation. So you pass a law, boom, you all have to do it on these new terms. And yet other times the world changes and forces us all to come up with something new, hurricanes, earthquakes, and such. The goal in combating racism, however, is not to change attitudes. To end racism and other forms of injustice, we have to dismantle society as we know it. That is, to dismantle the practices that we both engage in and identify with. This isn't just about what is effective, but what ending racism consists in. And to do this, we must work together, not just as individuals and on all fronts. So here's a picture. You've got education systems, transportation systems, healthcare systems, wage labor systems, legislative system, family social services, judiciary, law enforcement, incarceration, food production. There are many, 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 many more, obviously. They're all interdependent. And the idea is, as I see it, the main issue is to change those structures to be more just, right? To be such that we don't have the kind of extensive poverty and et cetera. So we must collectively find ways to engage elites. Sometimes that's going to be through prejudice reduction and such like that, so they can pass better laws. Bureaucrats who are going to have to apply the laws, broader institutions, culture. We need social change to change social meanings, technology. I think that the most important thing in promoting women's equality was the birth control pill. That's in the history of human beings. That technology changed the material conditions of sex, and boom, that made all the difference. It changed land and space allocations and such, and the ways the lands are shaped and spaces. And there was an empty line there because I thought there was something else that I forgot, but I forgot that I left it. So fill in your own favorite thing there. And also individuals. And we have to do this with sensitivity to history, geography, and biology, because we are still in the world and need to take account of how the world is going to push back. So obviously this is not a program, but it's important, I think, to see the big picture, in part because there are so many entry points and so many possibilities. So it's not like there's one way to change it, right? And you've got to find that one way and just do that. There are so many ways to make change. And we must maintain hope. So I'm going to read a longish part from Rebecca Solnit, because I think sometimes my views are very discouraging, and I find them discouraging. And so this has been helpful to me to read Rebecca Solnit, so I offer it to you. She says, cause and effect assumes history marches forward, but history is not an army. It is a crab scuttling sideways, a drip of soft water wearing away stone, an earthquake breaking centuries of tension. Sometimes one person inspires a movement, or her words do decades later. Sometimes a few passionate people change the world. Sometimes they start a mass movement and millions do. Sometimes those millions are stirred by the same outrage or the same ideal, and change comes upon us like a change of weather. All that these transformations have in common is that they begin in the imagination, in hope. I say this because hope is not like a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. I say it because hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency, because hope should shove you out the door, because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures, and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. Hope just means another world might be possible, not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action. Thanks.
I wanted to know why do you speak of the homeostasis instead of using the biological concept of social reproduction? I want only to know if there are differences in those two concepts. And also about the ignorance, I think it's a related concept, but I understand it, and if I have understood it, it's just like the supposition that they have an ethnicity contributes to racialize them. But that's the only difference with race. Because race is a social construction anyway. Because you were looking, it's a social construction, the physical or the color or any kind of sign may be used for racialization. And that is for race in general.
Okay, I take you have two questions. One is social reproduction and homeostasis. So I use homeostasis because it is a well-known phenomenon in the natural world and the biological world in particular. And this is connected to the kind of materiality of my view about the social, is that I want us to see that this is a phenomenon, the social reproduction is a phenomenon, and social self-perpetuation is a phenomenon that isn't just unique to the social domain, but that social domain is a kind of natural domain where this happens as well. Also, I think that some views about social reproduction spend a lot of emphasis on the cognitive dimension of social reproduction as being, you pass on ideas and such like that. But I'm more Bourdieuian, if that's a word, when I want it to be the material conditions are also important for the kind of social reproduction. So that's to that. And then the issue of race. So what I think is the process of racialization is going to be a marking of the group in terms of the supposed, the indicators of their, so this is why in terms of Maita's question, Muslim is special because it might have to do more with religion and belief, and the same with Jewish. Do Jews and do Muslims get racialized if the markings aren't about the links between their appearance and a certain geographical region? I think that for Latin America, it is linked. The markings, whether it be accent or whether it be appearance or whether it be, form of life, those are linked in an important way to assumptions about ancestry from a region. And so that makes it more plausibly a racialization of the group rather than, I don't know what it would be, a religionization, or I don't know what the word would be for that, but a marking. So the question is, what is the assumptions here of the meaning, the social meaning of these markers? So I think the social meaning of sex is going to be about reproductive capacities. What role do you play in reproduction? And so that role that you're assumed to play in reproduction gives rise to certain understandings of how you ought to be treated, what you should do in society, and those sorts of things. So the social meaning of sex, it gives you gender. Here, the social meaning of the body, by reference with where the social meaning is tied to assumptions about where you're from. So I think race is about othering across geographical boundaries. So you're not one of us, you're from over there, right? That's what race is doing, is taking those markers to be indicators that you came from over there, you're not really one of us. And so that's why the markers, how the markers are interpreted, their social meaning, and it gives you race. In the case of some groups, like the Amemsa, I think it's a mess, and I can't say exactly what it is. Part of it is you're from over there in that Arab region where things are so terroristic and violent or something like that, where you hate us, something like that. But it's also associated too with certain sets of beliefs and religion and things like that. So it's, I think, a bit more complicated. So the racialization for me comes through color.
Yes.
I think that people must should have criteria to make those attributions to other people who don't belong to their community or to people who they meet every day, because you can generalize when you just think about all the sphere, all the media that have always telling you about something, and you don't have knowledge, you don't reflect, you don't rethink about a situation. You just move like water in a current, and you don't argue yourself in a thinking way.
Yes.
Also, there are a lot of factors. The government should be professional. There must be people who make their jobs well in an ethical way, but they act like a simple person and moved by the mass. So I think that human beings must procure the others to have a better life, to enjoy life, not just create a system of evil. I think that we need to open our mind, to open our view, to see a human being as you. There's lack of empathy between people. So I think we just have to use our mind to think for the good of the others. That is the good of yourself.
Yeah, no, I agree that that's part of the story, that what we need to do is develop capacities to criticize our own attitudes and our own tendencies to flow like water, as you were saying, along certain paths. We need to be critical of all of that. But where I was beginning and when we started is that I think that we all enact these all the time, and that we shouldn't suggest that people are just being stupid or ignorant or whatever when they engage in these practices that harm other people. We're doing our best. We're taking, oftentimes we do take evidence for what we believe and act on that evidence. But the evidence has been distorted already, and because the world is distorted, so to speak. This is a kind of a Catherine McKinnon point, is that you can't just look around you and take generalizations to be the basis for your action, because the generalizations have already been so corrupted and so problematic that if you just act on those, you're in bad shape. So she's a law professor, and she's saying, look, if the law just says things, well, people like pornography, so, what's wrong with it? Are you going to tell me that there's something wrong with it when, 95% of men just love it? And you go, yes, I'm going to tell you that. Or, and the women like being objectified. Lots and lots of women like being objectified. They love it when, and you go, right. But just taking those generalizations and the pornographers say, we're just giving people what they want. We're not doing anything wrong. And you go, oh, please. This whole idea that you have to have something other than just empirical evidence to support your views. You need to be able to think modally, think about possibilities, have imagination. You need to think about value that goes beyond the reality. So I think that that's true. So what I want to say is, yes, we need to cultivate critical perspectives, cultivate imagination, cultivate a lot of different things in order to get us beyond the reality that we're in. I'm not sure that was respectful.
Tenemos 8 preguntas y 20 minutos, entonces por favor bueno, 8 no más ahora, pero 8 en la lista y ahora voy a añadir más, entonces por favor traten de ser lo más concisos posible. Sí.
Okay. I have a couple of questions. Thank you very much for your talk. The first one is related with your view about social topography. I find it quite similar to the notion of field of view, notion of social field.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether you are thinking in a micro level of sociology or a macro level of sociology. I mean, this schema is related with the whole system of capitalism, or it is related with a very local situation? That's my first question. My second question is related with the role of ideology. Is it possible to have a society without ideology?
Yeah.
It's possible to erase them with contrasting them?
So I don't know if it's possible to have a society without ideology, but I hope so. I think you can't have a society without a cultural techne, without a set of schemas that enable us to interact with each other meaningfully. I hope that it's possible to have one that is just, a cultural techne that is just, but I don't know. I mean, that's an empirical question that I can't answer. The issue of micro and macro, so that, I know we have a lot of questions, but let me just say one particular thing that I think is clear. I think you have to be at some level macro for this reason. So suppose you are someone who is you are in the government, you're in city council, right? And you have a certain amount of money to build swimming pools in your city. Your city happens to be shaped in a rectangle, very conveniently. And you say, I am egalitarian. I'm going to build our 6 swimming pools like that, right? So there's a kind of techne there that it's not a bad techne. It's a techne that's sort of saying, sort of equal distribution of things in a space is a good thing. But suppose the majority of the population lives here in high-rises buildings, mostly cement. They don't have any place to get outside very easily. And over here, there are big homes with their fancy swimming pools around them. Then it would be wrong, right? This is a bad way to distribute swimming pools in this area. So I think that you can't take a schema and decide in and of itself whether it's a good one or a bad one. You have to take the schema and see it situated in a particular context. And so what I would want to say that there's a little bit of micro and a little bit of macro there. It's macro in the sense that you have to step back from that particular schema and see how it's interacting with others in that context. But it's micro in that you're not going to be able to generalize from it. You're going to have to be looking at this particular situation. So on my view, these social meanings, they're not intrinsically good or bad. They're good or bad insofar as they function in this broad system. So I've said several times that they're functionally defined. So they're good or bad depending how they function in this big system. They're ideological by virtue of their functioning in a system that will produce something like this, which we think is unfair, as opposed to, building them that way or something like that.
Thanks, Ali.
Sure.
I still have a worry with the levels.
Yes.
Because I always thought you were thinking about the big thing, but today I think I'm confused.
Okay.
The thing is that when you talk about racism being a cultural technique, then it is not clear for me how do you individualize cultural techniques, because then it seems that racism is one and then feminism is another one, or not feminism,
sexism, yeah,
male chauvinism, or
whatever.
Yeah. And then you have many different cultural techniques which imply different practices, but that doesn't.
And they intersect.
They intersect, but then I thought that what you were thinking was about the whole society, because practices determine all those ways, and they intersect precisely because big picture we want to understand is the whole system, the whole social system, and not just these ideologies. Because
I don't know, I think it doesn't help understanding that they are different ideologies. I think they are part of one bigger or something like that ideology that makes us relate with each other in certain particular ways.
Yeah.
And that really tells you that different people, women or races or whatever, are to be treated differently.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
Good.
And so one other small thing is that I was thinking also about the social meanings, and then I also got a bit confused because I think that you can use your body markers as sites of contestation. So you can generate new social meanings, but that doesn't change social practices.
It does eventually.
You think? Well, okay, so these are 2 questions.
No, it does eventually. So 2 questions. So the first, really good, yes, I don't want there to be a hegemonic cultural techne that's just this big thing. I want it to be crazy fragmented, right? I'm sorry, that was crazy is a disparaging word for people with mental health issues, and I apologize for having used that. So the idea is, okay, you have something as simple as this practice of giving a talk, right? There's a lot of norms, a lot of assumptions about that. That's embedded, so you have a talk, and that's got its own sort of meanings. And there's a kind of techne that's there, right, of doing that. And then this is hooked up to academic life. And so there's going to be a broader techne for academic life. So academic techne. And then this is going to be all up into the whole education system, right? So there's going to be a techne that starts from preschool and goes all the way to PhD. So this is going to be broadly educational, a broad educational techne that goes there. Now this one is going to be hooked up with another set of technes. It's going to be hooked up with technes of wage labor, because what kind of labor you do. So there's going to be, and these are contingent. They're not, they're historical, they're contingent, they're all, and I want that kind of mosaic, you could even say, of these different things that are hooked up, they're glued together for a time, but you can crack them and they can separate out. Now, some of them aren't going to be completely separable because education is very likely going to be connected to labor, and knowledge and labor are going to be closely connected, but how it's connected to labor is is a question that can be combated or changed. And then this big cultural techne, it's going to be just a patchwork of things that are interconnected. So this is different from what the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School think. They think, Marcuse and all of them, there's just like the techne of industrialism or, whatever, but I don't want to go there. I want to have it be much more fragmented and contingent, because I think that opens up more spaces for disruption and change.
That makes you more optimistic.
It does. Yeah, it makes me more, and it also makes me more postmodern, even though, I'm kind of, none of the, the meta theory and all that kind of stuff. I don't want to go there. But your other question, I do think that disruption is possible, because I think this is like Butler. You start to perform your body differently, and then you create counterpublics where you together perform your bodies differently, and then you take over, take over the public with the counterpublic, and then, so I think that performativity is going to be a crucial part of that.
Hi, first, I want to thank you for your lectures, have been really amazing.
Thank you.
And also, I want to ask something about the macro level.
Yes.
Because, I want to specify something that you say in the page 4, when you say we will collectively find ways to change the elites. To change them or to eliminate them? Because I think that there are some questions about the macro level that I want to know. All these things that you propose, I agree with them, but how can we put in practice some kind of conditions in a capitalist system.
Yeah, no, I know.
I don't know what is your specific proposal for that. I don't know if that things can happen in a system that like we have now.
I know.
So I don't know what you think of that. I don't know if you have a political macro proposal of how we have to organize the economic system or political system, because I don't know what to be polemic, but I think that it's necessary.
Yeah, okay, so two things, changing the elites. I think that it is legitimate to have some, I don't think that egalitarianism commits us to saying that everybody has an equally authoritative role in every domain. So I think that, doctors ought to have authority in the medical domain, and judges ought to have authority in the legal domain if they've studied what the law is and such like that. And then they count as elites, and I think that we need elites because elites are connected to knowledge, et cetera, like that, and certain kinds of powers. And I don't think that we can have a society where everybody has the same amount of power in all domains. Okay, so that's that. But in terms of, so this is connected to the normative question. So what I think is that I'm anti-utopian, like any good Marxist. No, I'm anti-utopian. And I think that our movement has to be from the bottom up. That you can't, that the idea that you say, okay, this is the economy we need, and this is the social meanings that we ought to have and stuff like that from here, no, we don't. Partly because value, I've mentioned this before, value is path dependent. We don't know what life is going to be like after the revolution, right? After the revolution, we may have very different desires, very different visions of what's possible. We may value completely different things. And for us before the revolution, to say, no, after the revolution, it's all going to be like this, and we're going to have to structure it that way, I think is problematic. And I think it's bad. I'm against a certain kind of vanguardism. I'm not going to tell the movement what its aims ought to be. I'm going to be part of a movement. So from my point of view, you've got, here's the horrible system, and you've got constituencies in the horrible system that are trying to, fight for their own interests, but they're also going to hopefully work together to sort of bring about change. How we ought to change is going to be a matter of the responsiveness of people in the movement to the wrongs that are occurring. And there are going to be different ways to go. So I believe that many different paths are possible to lead us to justice. There isn't just one path. But what path is our path is going to be determined by what the people who are fighting the fight want and think that they need, and not by me telling them what they need or what they want. That would be my view. So I am a critical theorist in the sense that I ally myself with these social movements. I work with them to give them the tools that I can provide as a philosopher, but it's not my job to say what the aims of the movement ought to be. That's the movement of the people who are saying, and the way I think this happens, and this is partly because I think that the normative basis is what Iris Young calls desiring negation. Desiring negation is not, I want that, but I'm not putting up with this anymore, right? I'm not going forward from here on these terms. What are the terms then? It's a matter of coordination. So we've got to figure it out together. What are the terms, right? Not just someone saying. So if you think that the normative base is not the ideal, which I think is not, but desiring negation, the not this. And if the goal is coordination, that you move from the not this to say to the people that you're coordinating with, where can we go from here where we can agree that we're no longer with the not this. So that's the normative impulse that I'm working with. And I don't want to do ideal theory, and I think it's very problematic to do ideal theory. Some of the tools of ideal theory are useful, but spelling out the goal
Por favor, sí, no tengo mucha autoridad claramente como moderadora, por favor, mantener las preguntas que sean cortas, ¿sí? Para que todos podamos hablar.
I've been talking a lot about the homeostatic processes,
Yeah.
and they are creating the schemes, the practices, ideology, and all these things that you have been talking about now.
Yeah.
But then you began talking about Katrina, the color, the gender, and that makes me think, what if all this is caused by something natural? I mean, Freud and so many along with him thought or had thought that Eros, Thanatos, and the violence that comes with them is what is creating all this, no? Does that make it, or is part of the animal nature of the human being, no? Does that change at all your point of view?
Yeah, so I don't think there's much empirical evidence for anything Freud said. So
I know, but there are so many others.
Yeah, I haven't found any good empirical evidence favoring most of what has been offered by this idea of human nature being such as to dominate or such as to this. I do think, though, that there are definitely natural conditions, let me put it this way. I do believe that there is a certain predispositions humans have toward cognition and desire formation and such like that is completely natural. And one of the ones I think that plays a role in forming these social categories is the disposition to essentialize. So there's been there's a work called The Essential Child by, her name begins with a G. She's at Harvard. I can't remember it right at the moment. I can give it to you. It's just slipped my mind. But where there are that human beings tend to be able very early on to distinguish, or not always accurately, but to distinguish accidental regularities from predict some kind of lawful generalizations or something like that, ones that they can use as a basis for induction. And it's really fascinating, right? Because at very early age, you can give them children a single example of something, and they will use some of those examples as a basis for predicting what will happen next, and others as example they won't use as a basis for predicting what's next. Whoa, this is kind of remarkable, right, that we do this. But we don't always do it correctly. If you read some of the work by Sarah Jane Leslie, she uses some of this in her discussion of, some of the research she's done about generics. So generics are these sentences that one form of which it starts with a bare plural, like women are submissive, or birds fly, or dogs, are mammals, thing like that. There's not the dog or a dog, but dogs just like that. And so if you look at when children start, and they do have this tendency to think that when you use a term like that, it suggests that you can use that as a basis for prediction. And so you look and you try and get children to sort of figure out when they start making these sorts of generalizations by the stories you read to them. And it's absolutely fascinating that in some, you read them a certain kind of story and they say, yes, she uses them, zarpies. These are the creatures, zarpies. They're an imaginary creature. You read them a storybook about zarpies. You read them one kind of storybook and they say, and you ask them questions afterwards, this is a zarpie, like this other zarpie, will it eat flowers too? And in some cases they say, yes, it will eat flowers too. And depending on the story, or in another case, they won't. They can't use it as a basis for prediction. So this ability that we have to distinguish very primitive level lawful generalizations from non-lawful or just contingencies, I think is important for trying to think about race, for example. So if you are encountering, there's a person at Michigan, who's done some of the work on this, is if you're exposed to racial differences, there's a tendency to use the essentializing strategy to essentialize race, and the same for gender and the same for certain other groupings. And it takes work to pull that off. So I do think that there's interesting psych research on this, and it is not very encouraging, some of it, but there are ways of breaking those essentializing dispositions around categories that aren't really worth essentializing. So by giving lots of counterexamples and such like that. That's a long answer to your question. But yes, I do think that there are natural predispositions that we have both cognitively and motivationally that we have to take into account in thinking about this. I just don't think Freud got any of them.
Tenemos cuatro preguntas, entonces voy a pediros que las hagáis y una sola respuesta. So we will 4 more questions and then you can give just one answer.
Okay,
to
that sounds
all of
good.
them. Okay.
Yes.
So es Pedro, Carlos, Axel y Diego. Y cerraremos la sesión con su respuesta.
Yeah, the question about the concept of ideology. As you know, there are Marxists, among them a very famous professor at the School of Philosophy here at UNAM, Sanchez Vasquez, who think of ideology not only as the set of beliefs that helps to maintain the status quo, but also as a weapon, as an instrument to change society. You know, the workers' ideology that we need to promote in order to change society. And using your characterization of ideology as a cultural techne, we could think or even realize that there are some social groups that are already organized according to this ideology that we should promote.
Yes.
And in that case, we have a pluralistic conception of ideologies, and not a conception that puts ideologies in one side and the truth of the science in the other side.
Yeah.
So what do you think about this idea of concept as an instrument to change?
So I have to wait for all 4.
Yes, please, because otherwise.
Okay.
Carlos.
Yeah, yes. Well, my question has to do with the role of USA Academy in setting the agenda of how we are to understand globally racialization. In a way, it's very frustrating for the rest of the world to see that all the important philosophical discussions about race and racialization is the North American setting, what counts as race and racialization, and there's not much of comparative information about empirically how people are being racialized all over the globe. So that's my question. I mean, it's like making generalizations, inductions of the processes without really taking into account that 90% of the racialization that is going on. For instance, in Mexico, I mean, we have our own ways of racializing ourselves and othering our groups, which is very different. And that, for instance, is interesting because a lot of the Mexican Americans are moving from one space of racialization into the other just by moving geographically. Totally. And race, as a lot of people say, doesn't travel. So it's very schizophrenic, very, and we are not understanding that. And we're not understanding a lot of other phenomena because of the American academia dominating so hugely the field. So what's your stance on that?
Axel.
Something that is bothering me, I'm sorry, bothering is the wrong word, but...
No, bother, I don't mind.
You have been insisting on criticizing the ideology position all the time, and today it was a very big topic. But on the other hand, you also want D to be, what you call question D, the question about the explanation, to be central to the process of liberation. And I see a tension there, because D is still an intellectual question. It's still a question about explanations, not about action. So how do you solve that tension between criticizing overly epistemological answer and at the same time giving such an important place to explanations, especially?
Diego.
For me, I have a doubt with the ideal as in planning a perfect society, not as, no, to use it as a tool, not as an absolute for what we want to reach, but just as a tool to move masses in a certain way. Because, well, I do believe that if you cannot set a goal for the people you want to follow you, it will be very difficult for many to just say, okay, I will follow you without something planned. But again, not as an absolute, just as a tool to move people towards what you want. And in that way, also accepting that maybe what you want is at least better than what already is. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I'm going to start with the last first. Catherine McKinnon has a great line when she's asked, what do women want? And she says, first get your foot off my neck and then we can talk about it. And I think that there's a part of me that feels that is where I'm coming from, is that I'm not even sure I know what I want until I can begin to see over the mountain, over the hill on the other side. So what I first want is the foot off my neck, right? And then what she said, get your foot off my neck, and then we can talk about it. It's not get your foot off my neck, and then I'm going to tell you what is going to be the right answer. Get your foot off my neck so that we can carry on together to have a conversation about what's going to be better, right? And so so that's the vision of the background. But I agree with you that as a matter of psychological fact, oftentimes you can't just stick with the negative. You can't just say, we want, relief from oppression. Well, what is, I think you need something more, a greater vision than that. And that you do find that in many of the great charismatic leaders. So I'm sympathetic with that concern. Explanation versus action. I think that I want informed action. And so from my view, I'm here we have to have the action, we have to dismantle society. I'm not, as I mentioned, I think I'm not very good at figuring out how to do that as a matter of actual fact. But, and so that makes it hard to have a program as well, right? I don't know how to do that. But what I think is that there are mistakes that people are making that have to do with, we're just going to do more implicit bias trainings, and I'm going to scream, even though I do them myself. And so what I think I'm offering here is a tool to enable me to work with others where they can be better informed about these different sites and the interconnection and the causal, and the homeostasis in that. Now, I have to admit that I think activists typically know this already, right? They're not stupid, right? And so it's more trying to say to academics and others, look, what we're doing could be so much more effective if we were more empirically grounded, more connected to the movement, more offering ourselves for that, rather than certain other tasks that academics tend to take on and certain other projects that they take on. And so it's does that make any sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I still have doubts.
Yeah, no, I do too. I mean, believe me, where this all started was yet again, for about the 100th time, I was thinking of giving up the academic life. And so it's been the last 10 years or so going, really, where does the academic life fit here anyway? And this is the best I've gotten to, right? Which probably isn't enough. But I'm also an activist. And I'm working, and so I'm actually working right now on a project which is bringing together people working on multiple things at the same time in the same space to do this kind of let's see what these interconnections are and how what's happening with the environment and what's happening on race and what's happening on gender and LGBTQ, how they're connected, right? And so we're doing that. And so I think of that as, something that is moving forward and is more hopeful to build these coalitions. And I think that is consistent with what I'm trying to do here. Carlos, oh my God, you're so right. So in the US academic world, part of what this is just the sort of the black-white binary. We get caught in this black-white binary, and it's overwhelming to us, and we can't think beyond that black-white binary. And I've tried to work somewhat in US sort of thinking beyond the binary, thinking about, Latinos and Latinas in the US and about Asian Americans in the US. But it's true that there's very different things in all different parts of Latin America and in Rwanda and in former Yugoslavia and in Japan. I mean, and the caste system, how is the caste system like and unlike a racial system? I mean, these are huge questions. And I totally agree with you that that this critical race theory has really been preoccupied with the American context. And part of I don't have an excuse. I think that I haven't done enough of the empirical research and read enough of the work by people who are working on race in other contexts and other cultures. That said, what I want to not do, I don't have the time or the empirical background to be able to generalize. And so what I think of is when I talk about race, I have to just add a qualifier that race in the US works this way, not that race globally works this way, because I think it doesn't. And so, and race doesn't move. And so what I would love to do is find more opportunities to just learn about the other phenomena, the other social manifestations of these sorts of things. And I'm embarrassed that I'm just reinforcing the U.S. hegemony on these sorts of things. So I have much to learn. And it's we gotta have more international conferences on these issues and not just nationally based conversations. So I agree. And also, on ideology can be a tool for change. I think it can. I just have opted for a linguistic choice to say that ideology is the bad stuff, and it's one form of a cultural techne. I think it would be fine if we opted for a different linguistic choice to say that even the empowering ones are ideologies. I think that there are different traditions that are invoked depending on which linguistic choice you make. And I am standing in the tradition, I'm trying to situate myself in a tradition that says that ideologies are problematic because, and I think this is that the focus of my attention is really how and why we enact injustice contrary to what we're aiming to do, right? Why, this is what's really at the base of it, is my own experience of being, a white American privileged woman and saying, I want nothing more than I want social justice. That is what I want more than anything. But contrary to my good intentions and all the work I do, I enact injustice all the time. And so the issue for me is that. And so the question is, what is it that is making that not only possible, but feeling almost inevitable? And so I've given the name ideology to that, but I could have used another term. So I agree that we need to look at the other counterpublics and the forms of life that they promote and encourage the development and expansion of those.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos por quedaros en esta sesión que se alargó un poquito. Thank you very much, Sally, for a fantastic discussion.
Thank you for staying. I know we went over, but I really appreciate your questions and all of your input very much.